Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was allegedly warned that the January 6th event could become violent. That revelation is according to testimony from former White House official Cassidy Hutchinson to the January 6th Select Committee. A nearly 250-page court filing late on Friday included transcripts from her testimony. Hutchinson told the committee, quote, "I know that there were concerns brought forward to Mr. Meadows," adding she was unsure if he perceived them to be as genuine concerns. She told the committee she was not sure what, if anything, Meadows did with that warning. It was not clear from Hutchinson's testimony what intel Meadows actually received. NBC News has reached out to Meadows' attorney for comment. Jackie, you're following all of this. Mark Meadows has a lot of questions coming at him in terms of what he knew about January 6th and when he knew it. And now this report that he might have even understood a concept that it would have been violent. I guess the question will be what he did with that information.
Yeah, Mika, this 248 brief that came out on Friday night, almost at midnight after a pretty crazy week of news cycles, really provided a broader picture of what the committee, the legal argument that the committee is trying to make as we move towards these public hearings. And that's that various people in the White House potentially were involved with some sort of criminal conspiracy to defraud and obstruct Congress. And there are various examples. The most significant one provided in the briefing was that Cassidy Hutchinson, a close aide to Mark Meadows, said that Meadows was directly notified of potential violence on January 6th. And there have been previous reports that showed that people in the White House were made aware of this intelligence, that there was going to be violence on the 6th. But this is the first time that we've heard someone close to Meadows say that he was directly notified. And again, that question that you just asked, what did he do with that information? That's what the January 6th committee wants to know. There are also other examples in this filing of Meadows being told specific things about the day's events. For example, that there was no constitutional basis for the plan to overturn the results of the elections, that there would be mass resignations if the plan to seize voting machines was implemented. So you see the committee documenting various steps along the way where Meadows was explicitly told that what the former president was engaging in and what he was helping him do, helping him try to execute some of these efforts was illegal, unconstitutional, and that he should stop. And again, the question is what did Meadows do with that information?
So, Michael, if you had any updates in terms of the timeline of the January 6th committee that they seem to be operating under and whether we're going to see those public hearings that have been rumored for quite some time, let us know. But also, just wanted to give you a moment if you wanted to address the first clip that we played at the top of this, which was Perdue flat out saying at the start of the debate the other night against Brian Kemp, the Republican governor's race in Georgia, that the 2020 election was fraudulent and that it was stolen. And we know that we hear that from Donald Trump all the time, but it still seems surprising to have it so front and center from what had been considered a somewhat mainstream Republican until this.
Well, I think, you know, if you look at the developments of the past week and what we have learned from the audio that came out about McCarthy or the filing that came out about Meadows, is that these members of Congress, whether it was McCarthy who was talking to Trump or it was Meadows who was talking to Jim Jordan and Scott Perry and other members, is that the members of Congress have important information that is central to the question of whether the Congress's acts were obstructed. Maybe they were obstructed by members of Congress. And if the committee continues on the trajectory that they're on, a gaping hole in their report, because these are clearly identified as central players in what went on. Kevin McCarthy talking, to other members, talking to the President of the United States, obviously with a clear-eyed view through some of that audio of what was going on. Meadows, it looks like, in on the plans with these other members like Jim Jordan. But the committee has shown an unwillingness to subpoena them, to force them to answer questions. And the committee can have all of the public hearings that it wants, But without those individuals and without a fuller picture of what went on around them, it will not be a full authoritative account of what happened in the lead up to and during January 6th.
And Michael Schmidt, what would be the reason not to subpoena them?
Well, I think there are two or two and a half or three reasons for that. One of them is that legal experts would say that the members would have a decent argument in court because of the speech and debate protections that they have as members of Congress, that this is an area that hasn't been tested and that Democrats don't want to do that, and that there is a feeling from Democratic leadership in the House that if they were to cross this line, then when the Republicans win back control of Congress, if they were to do that, they would then turn that power on the Democrats themselves, and they don't want to set that precedent. So they're afraid of doing that because of what could happen to them down the line.
Michael Schmidt, thank you very much. And coming up, could the 20...